here's where the situation is. When they found out I was blind, my dad told all my other brothers, you guys got two good eyes. You need to fend for yourself. We've got to work with Tom and, help him to develop. And, of course, they resented that. And that's probably the main reason they have nothing to do with me today, because my mom and dad gave me all the attention and affection they could possibly do it. Now, I didn't ask for it, but, that was just something that they did, Jim. So anyhow, I went to school in Columbus. I was in kindergarten, and at the School for the Blind back then in kindergarten, and I don't know how it was at KSB because I don't know anything about KSB, but it was basically an orientation year to get you away from home and to introduce you to life in a residential school for the blind. There were about 220 other kids there from all other parts of Ohio at the time. And many of them did not go home. Their parents didn't have the money, or some of them just didn't want the kids, okay? And so what happened was they just stayed, and the state took care of them. They got to go home on major holidays. So anyway, that was that. I finally got used to it. I would cry every time they'd bring me back every weekend, and my brother said, if you don't shut up, I'm taking you to the superintendent, and he has an electric paddle that he's going to use on you to shut you up, give you something to really cry about. Well, I shut up. And so that's what happened there, Jim. Well, kindergarten segued into first grade, and at that time we started learning Braille. And I didn't want to learn to read it because nobody that I knew read this stuff, I said, man, I want to read the books with the blank pages. See, I couldn't understand why I was different. Why couldn't I do what my brothers did? And the teacher tried to tell me, Tom, you can't do it. She says, here's a print book. Tell me what the page says. Tell me what you see. And so I just ran my hands. Well, I don't see nothing. She says, that's my point. There is print on there, but without sight, you can't possibly see it. So to make a long story short, I failed first grade. Like she told my mom and dad, Tom is memorizing things and not learning. So anyhow, the second year I was back before at OSSB, I thought, well, what can I do? What do I like to do? Well, radio, man, that's cool. So I started dialing around on the radio. I didn't understand a whole lot of things about why the dial was laid out as it was. Remember now, I was just a 6-year-old kid. And my babysitter at the time introduced me to a station in Dayton, WING, owned by the Great Trails Broadcasting Corporation. I believe KLO in Louisville was owned them at one time. And I liked it. But the problem was at sunset, local sunset, they changed their pattern and lowered their power. And I would cry and cry and cry. You would have thought someone died. And, we would visit people who lived in other parts of the county, and they would have WING, and I couldn't understand why they could hear it, and I couldn't hear it. So I said to Dad, boy, I wish you would move to where we could hear WING all the time. And he said, well, son, I do well to keep a roof over your head now. And so he bought our place where we lived on Possum Road on the GI Bill back in '46. And so my interest in radio came. We had a local station, which I referred to, WBLY. And it went off the air at local sunset. It had an FM, but I didn't know much about FM. I thought you just changed the dial from AM to FM, and there it was. Well, I didn't learn the difference until the spring of '61, how the FM dial was laid out. And back in the day, the FCC had a special table of allocations on the FM dial that where stations could only have an ERP of 3,000 watts horizontal and 3,000 watts vertical at that time. And so anyhow, in 1960, one brother got a job as a salesman for WBLY. And my first experience, they had a talk show on there, a guy named Smilin' Bob, Robert Young, who was the CEO at that time of the Champion City Broadcasting Company. Let me identify. This is K4LID.
And KC9VKV, Tom, your signal is excellent. Stayed up all the way, no fades. I wanted to ask you, you were talking about when you were younger, did you have a conception of what the printed page was, or did you have any idea what it was, since you've never saw one,
No, I didn't, Jim. I had no idea. I didn't understand why I couldn't read it. All I could do was feel a blank page, and I thought, man, but then when I learned Braille there for a time, I said, man, why can't print be like Braille? And I can get into another discussion about how Braille is and why it has to be the way it is, but no. I had absolutely no conception of the printed page because, in print, you can make the fonts bigger or smaller. But in Braille, you don't have that luxury.
Roger that. Roger that. And so you went to the school for the blind, and how many years did you go to that school?
Well, I was there from September of '57 until June of '68, when I left there and went home to school to finish out my high school years at my beloved Shawnee High School in Springfield. Well, at the School for the Blind, they had started a radio club sponsored by CORS, the Central Ohio Amateur Radio Service. And there were two instructors that came to the school beginning in 1960. And what they would do, they would teach the code, and then they would also teach the theory. And the Columbus Amateur Radio Club gave the school a station. We had a Collins 75A3 receiver. We had a Central Electronics 200V transmitter, and we had homemade crystal-controlled transmitters for the novice band. And so they had switches, and we had Braille markings with a Braille label maker. When you turn the switch one way, like we had 37. At that time, the novice band was 3700 to 3750. And we had, and the 40-meter band was 7150 to 7200 then. And so we got on the air as we could, but the administration kind of frowned on that. So it didn't happen, and I don't know what happened since it was a volunteer thing. The guys from the radio club quit coming to school. Well, I decided in 1962, the last year that my dad was alive, that I wanted to learn the code. So a friend of mine, the same one who worked at WBLY, who basically was the CEO, the Champion City Broadcasting Company, of course, which is no more and been gone. He was the one that ran the thing, and there was an attorney and a businessman in Springfield who were the three people behind WBLY. Well, there was a department store in Springfield then called Fashion Fair. And I'd gotten one of these Caravel sets or whatever it was, and it was I don't know what it really was, Jim. It was an AM radio with a little microphone. You could play radio, but it just didn't work right. Well, in the process, I got a 45 record of learning the Morse code. So the easiest letters for me to learn were S, H, and I. And I don't have to tell you what the last letter was. And I just, I thought, man, that is cool. So then I learned O. So, hey, man, what if you send SOS, 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 SOS? So, I didn't put this in the article you read, but my brother made me mad one day. And I had heard that if you took a flashlight and you heard a plane go over, we live fairly close to the Springfield Municipal Airport. I heard that if you would take that flashlight, send SOS, SOS, the pilot would, might see it, or you could say hi, did it, and the pilot might wave his wings at you. So I got mad at my brother, and I said, I'll fix you. So I heard a plane, I took that flashlight for all I was worth and kept doing that. And there was another plane, and another, I kept doing that, Joe. Well, I got bored with the game. And it wasn't about a half hour, 45 minutes later, the sheriff's department came out and said, we're looking for somebody who was sending code with a light. And a pilot thought he recognized the location. So I had some tall explaining to do about that. So, anyhow, that was one of the things with the code that I did. And in 1965, we had a new industrial arts teacher, Starling Hutt, W8 Quebec Echo Mike. And he did not know how to teach blind guys how to work with power tools and all that. He was afraid. And at the time, the school, because of lack of funding then, could not get the teachers they needed with the expertise that would have been required, Jim. So, anyhow, I wasn't in the class. It was another class. Somehow he found out that we had a ham station and everything. And he said, well, what do you guys want to do? Learn industrial arts or learn ham radio? Yeah, we want ham radio, man. Forget about that old junk. So that's all we did. And if you got your license, you had an A the rest of the year, whether you did anything or not. You could sleep in the class. He didn't care. So anyhow, I learned the code. I had a hard time with that. And, you know, A, da, B, da, da, and all that. So, man, I can't get it. So a buddy of mine says, hey, Tom, I know how we can do this, how you can learn it real quick. If we tell dirty jokes with the code, and we all people names and everything, son, you can get it. Well, he was right. I learned it overnight, and I passed my code test 2 or 3 days later. Well, that was okay, Jim, but the theory presented a problem for me, buddy, for the novice. And my test came in, and me and a bunch of guys, we took it on a cold, snowy January in '66. And I failed. My instructor said, and likens, you did stinking. So anyway, what happened was I said, oh, man, I don't know how to fool with this. So anyhow, to make a long story short, I did get my novice ticket. But then I heard that, man, all the rigs, you had to load and tune and dip the plate, and I knew I was in trouble. In the meantime, I had gotten into CB back in '63. Of course, my mother had to get the license because they would not issue me a call sign since I was less than 18. And so I thought, hey, man, CB's kind of cool. That's a whole other story. But anyhow, I was enjoying the heck out of it. I was in the junior CB club, the president of it, and really wreaking havoc with the CBers in Springfield and Clark County back in the day. I could write you a book on some of those things, too. We had CB jamborees that were like ham fests and coffee breaks at various restaurants and visiting different people's houses and stuff. That was really neat back then. So anyway, I passed my test, and I wanted a rig. Well, in Christmas of '65, we went down to Custom Electronics in Dayton. It was on Brown Street there by where the VA hospital is, a National Cash Register, and went in there and bought a Telekrafter SX120 receiver, which I didn't know. It was just a communications receiver. It really wasn't a ham receiver. And it was hot on the broadcast band and mediocre everywhere else. You couldn't hear sideband on it. On CW drifting and everything. So I got my license, and Mom said, well, you need a better receiver. So we went back and bought a Hammerlin HQ110. Well, back at that time in Springfield, Ohio, there was about a dozen radio stores there, Jim. We had Lafayette Radio, we had Eberly Radio, we had Standard Radio, we had R&R Communications, Biggs Electronics, Herb's Radio and TV. Everybody had some sort of ham radio stuff. DeVore Electronics in Enid, and all this, man, that was just so cool, man. It was the radio mecca, other than if you lived in Dayton or Columbus, because it was right between them. So anyway, the guy at the Lafayette store had this Heathkit DX20. Well, he said, I know you're going to burn this thing up.
So tell me about tube-type radios and how a blind person functions with that.
Well, everybody has their own way. At the time under discussion, I didn't know that there were any audible meters around, so to make a long story short, I got disgusted with ham radio and got out of it. I said, man, if you just have to load and tune, I said, I don't need ham radio, forget about it. Well, the exception to that rule was the Central Electronics 200V and the 100V. which you did not have to load or tune. That was a broadband transmitter made by Central Electronics, and it used bias batteries in it. They had another way to deliver the bias, and I don't understand how it all worked. So anyway, I just got out of ham radio when all this happened, and so then my interest started going into what would be my, I guess you might say my avocation, which was police communication. And when I was a junior in high school, actually it started before that, when I was a sophomore, a friend of mine had been elected sheriff of the county at that time, and I called him and said, man, I'd like to come down there and learn how to dispatch. So anyhow, it never got to happen until I was a junior in high school. I was the happiest kid in the world. Our sheriff at the time, who was Harold M. Bud Mills, who, by the way, was a bonus baby for the New York Yankees, and I didn't know that till he passed this last April. He had an anti-drug program that he put on in all the schools in Clark County then. And I was sitting down in front, and he came to me and says, what are you doing this afternoon? I said, well, I'll just go home and just kick around on the radio, I guess. He said, well, why don't you come down and we'll talk about you coming to work. I'll tell you what, Jim, butter wouldn't melt in my mouth. I wanted the school day, and so I ran off the bus and told Mom I had to go to the sheriff's office. She said, what are you talking about? She'd been working in the yard and the garden. Well, I got to clean up, so she took me down, and they said they'd bring me back home. So in the meantime, I had been listening to the statewide sheriff's network, which at that time was on VHF low band, and it operated similarly to how the Kentucky State Police used 2 years ago. So I'd memorized everybody's call sign in the area, their numerical sequences and all that. And he and his chief administrator, J. Arthur Schumann, were impressed. So to make a long story short, I started working there that Saturday in April of 1970. And I learned real quick that a lot of what goes on never gets out on the air. And so I enjoyed that, but later on I had a problem of my own making. And so I didn't know any better, and I was just a young, immature kid when I look back on it. I said something on the radio that I shouldn't have said. I didn't cuss anybody out, but I demeaned their character over the air, literally. Well, that was my undoing. So when I was told not to come back, I said, does the sheriff know about this? And the sergeant said, I don't know, and I don't care if he does or not. So I went home and told Mom about it. So my mom, who's always been my #1 defender, called every deputy she could find and said, has my son ever done anything or said anything to offend you? Because if he does, and if he did, he will apologize. I'll drag his sorry butt down there, and he'll straighten it out. And one of my friends on another shift, Jim Harper, said he's one of the nicest young men I've ever met. He says, it's these other guys that are the problem. So I called the sheriff Monday, and I told him, I asked him if he'd heard about it. He said, yeah, I heard a little bit about it. So I explained my side, and he said, well, you come back down this next weekend, and we'll iron it out. So that Saturday I went back down, and I was walking through there, and all of a sudden that sergeant started to speak, and the sheriff came through, and he said, Sergeant Posey, Tom's going to dispatch on the weekend. You've got stuff to do out in the cruiser. Well, that was okay, Jim, but the deputies gave me a cold shoulder. They wouldn't do anything for me. You know, if I had them, if they were going to eat someplace, I'd have them get me something and bring it in. They wouldn't even do that. And they wouldn't even give me any food that they had fixed at the jail. And things just got from bad to worse, bad to worse. So I finally saw that I wasn't wanted, so I just quit. Well, that was after I went to the college prep program at the University of Evansville, where they used to send blind kids back in the 70s to see you know, if they could hack it in college, because you took a couple of college courses in the summer quarter there. And I guess I did okay, and I was entered in a 2-year program, what was then Clark County Technical Institute. It's now Clark State College today. And I was in the law enforcement program, of course. And that didn't work out for me because I did not have any books. You know, back then, it was tough to get any books brailled. All the books I had, if I got them, were on open reel tape. And I just didn't get them. So I withdrew midterm, and in the meantime, my brother who lived here, my oldest brother, who came down here many years ago, he was dying of brain cancer. And what we would do, we would send cassette tapes back and forth. And I just made the statement offhandedly, well, if you guys down there ever need a good dispatcher, you let me know. Well, I never thought anything about it, Jim. The state wanted me to go for vocational evaluation at Goodwill Industries in Dayton. And I told them that if I ever had a job, I was leaving, I was terminating myself. Here again, I was told I was being very immature, I was acting like a kid. Blind people just didn't do what I did. And I was being totally unrealistic. So, on the last Friday of June of '72, I just gotten home. And I got a call. My brother says, get your clothes packed. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, they're having a big celebration down here around the 4th of July, the sesquicentennial. And he and the mayor were good friends. My brother did electrical contracting for the city at that time. And he said, I told him about you, and he's interested. He says, you got the job if you want it. So I came down to Louisa, and he said, if nothing else, you might have fun for a week or two, and then you can go back and just chalk it up as an experience. Well, man, that's all I can think about. Man, a job that actually, you know, paid. Of course, I didn't realize a lot of the other things that went along with the job, like long hours and, oh man, your relief not showing up. You had to stay. You couldn't leave. So that time went, and my brother said, well, you know, I'm sick and I'm dying. He said, I cannot rack you back and forth from town to 13 miles each way where I live. He said, we're going to have to find you a place here in town to live. And we looked at the paper, and there was a little mobile home for rent, just about like a travel trailer. And it was, he says, now, you know, this is with walking distance of your work. So you can learn how to walk there by yourself and back to work. You've got to be able to get back and forth by yourself. Which, of course, I knew. They taught that to us at Goodwill Industries in Dayton. Well, anyway, he said, but first we need to see if you got a job. So I went to the chief of police, and I said, his name was Dempsey Bradley, and I said, Dempsey, you know, this thing's over. Do I go back to Springfield or do I stay? And he said, quote, hell no, Tom, you can't go. You got to stay. Of course, at that time, we were only getting paid $1 an hour was all we were getting. And later on, the pay went up in December to $1.50 an hour, and then as minimum wage went up, why, it went up. So that's how I came to Louisa. There are a lot of stories and things I've been involved with. The Great Fire in 1974 that I dispatched by myself. There's no help in the town, just about was leveled. And that's a sum and substance of how that was, Jim. KC9VKV, K4LID.
Roger, Tom. KC9VKV. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I really wanted to check out a couple of things here. You, as you were in your amateur radio career in the beginning, had some kind of disastrous results with a power amplifier or linear that blew up or burned up in the house because of, was it bad tuning, or what happened there?
It was a Heath VX20 transmitter, put out 35 watts. The antenna was poorly constructed, and I had no clue what I was doing.
Roger. And so the amplifier was running untuned or detuned, Roger?
Well, there was no amplifier, Jim. It was a novice transmitter. There was no amplifier.
Roger, I got you. But it did meet its demise, and the odor did linger in the household for a little while, Roger?
About a year, yes. Mom tried everything she could to get rid of it, but she couldn't get rid of it.
And, of course, she blamed you for that, Roger?
Well, she understood, so no, not really, but I always heard about it enough. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I think we all have our crosses to bear from our younger lives as fledgling electronic experts and making some decisions that, in retrospect, maybe we could have prevented if we had better knowledge of our situation, Roger.
Well, that's right, and I didn't know what I was doing, and you know, my brothers were all gone. There was just me and Mom. She said she was working. She didn't know. And I was literally on my own.
Roger. Well, Tom, I have enjoyed the QSO with you, sir, and if there's anything that you wanted to add that we haven't touched on, go ahead.
All right, well, I will tell you how I got back into ham radio.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, I was out of it until I came back to Kentucky. And I met a couple of hams here in town. One of them's a silent key now. And I asked him if there was any activity here in Louisa. And yeah, well, we get on now and then. And this other guy said, yeah, we want to put on a repeater here in Louisa, and we'd like you to be the control operator and monitor the thing, but you got to get your license. I said, man, I don't care nothing about amateur radio. It's stupid. I said, it's just an advanced form of CB is all it is. Well, a former policeman wanted me to teach him the code, so I did. And he took his code test and passed it. And I don't know if it was a mistake or not, but when the written came back, he got his test, and then there was an extra test. So my other buddy said, well, Tom, I got a test here. You might as well see if you can pass it and take it. So I did. And, okay, I got my call sign. My call sign at that time was WD4RWU, issued in 78. And so anyhow, I studied and got my tech ticket. And they put the repeater on the air. And I guess the rest is history. I upgraded and got my general back in 81. And I've been on HF pretty much since that time, Jim.
Roger. Tom, I've enjoyed speaking with you, and we're going to put this thing together. It probably is running long at the moment, so I'm going to have to do a little editing inside, but sure appreciate the story, man.
Well, I'm glad to do it. I really appreciate you asking me. I've got more stories and things I could tell. I could tell you about the Great Fire of '74, and I could tell you about a guy from Murder Incorporated coming into town to try to kill somebody. Man, we got a lot of stuff that went on here back in the day.
Well, let's just mark this to be continued, Roger.
Well, we can do it, Jim. I've got a lot of stories I can tell you.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it. KC9VKV.
Thank you, Jim. KC9VKV, K4LID.